Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Yogesh Kumaran. I'm an MD PhD student at the University of Toledo and also part of the Young Scientists Committee with the VPH. And today I'll be moderating our session on what do modelers do outside of academia. So just a quick word on the VPH Institute. It's the Society for In Silico Medicine. We're an international nonprofit organization. We're dedicated to the development and bridge building of the virtual physiological human. Our goal is to move beyond isolated research and towards integrating simulation into clinical practice, as well as through regulatory pathways, all with the goal of improving healthcare outcomes. So today's session, we're moving beyond the equations and looking at the professional journeys of these three individuals. We've invited three awesome experts to share their career stories from their roots in academic research to their current roles in industry, startups, and regulatory bodies. We really want to understand what the day in the life looks like for each of these individuals and, on to the next regulatory submissions, the next surgical applications, or their next commercial products. So to help us navigate this, the three individuals are Dr. Vivek Palepu from the US FDA, Dr. Ingmar Fleps from Zimmer Biomet, and Dr. Lakshmi Dasi from Dasi Simulations in Georgia Tech. And get started with Vivek.
Yeah, welcome everyone. And thanks to VPH Institute committee for this invitation and for the opportunity for me to present here and share this amazing panel. So I'll start with my introduction once again, that I'm a regulatory scientist at FDA in CDRH. And today I'm going to briefly share my journey from computational modeling in academic lab to performing regulatory science at FDA. So this is a disclaimer from my side. This is purely my opinion. It should not be misconstrued as HHA's or FDA's opinion. So I'll cover mainly a few areas. I'll start with my academic background, how I started my PhD, what did I learn there, and how I got an opportunity at FDA, and how did I discover the regulatory science, and what is regulatory science. And I'll give you a glimpse of my day-to-day work at FDA. And then I'll speak how modeling is being conducted in a regulatory space, and my 2 cents to the young modelers. So I started my journey with biomedical engineering bachelor's from India in a city called Hyderabad. And I graduated in 2008 from bachelor's, and I applied to University of Toledo for master's, but they were starting a MS plus PhD integrated program and offered me a PhD program based on my research work in bachelor's. So I joined Dr. Goel's lab, who was working on orthopedic biomechanics. So that's where I first got introduced to the term computational modeling, FEA, and how FEA is used in orthopedic biomechanics. So in the lab, his lab was called as ECORE, which is Engineering Center for Orthopedic Research Excellence. So over there, I learned different corners of preclinical testing, especially for spinal devices and orthopedic devices, what kinds of preclinical testing was performed. And the reason that we were gaining that experience was that that lab collaborated with a lot of industry partners who were coming and generating their data for FDA submissions. So I didn't realize it at that time that I was already creating evidence for the regulators. So this gave me an interesting perspective, and this gave me exposure to the rigor that needed for the regulatory decision making, even before I knew what regulatory space was. So in this lab, I was exposed to different skills like cadaver testing and computational modeling, and then how to evaluate device mechanically for the preclinical testing based on the standards and guidance documents, and also the wear testing of these devices. So all these studies or projects that I did for industry, as I mentioned, it was using data that was generated in the academic lab, and it was being made a part of the reports that were submitting to FDA or any other regulatory body in the world. So apart from what I was, the skills that I acquired as part of the industry projects, my dissertation focused purely on academic research, which was whiplash injury biomechanics. So for this project, I developed a 3D finite element model of the human head to pelvis, and it was a complex computational project. And the key skills, or the important highlights of this work was I had to validate the model for both quasi-static as well as dynamic loading conditions. And we explored how not only the normal body posture, but out of occupant body seating posture would affect the injury outcome. So this taught me the importance of validation and thinking how the validation uncertainty and other FEA intricacies would impact the computational predictions to real world outcomes. So these principles became foundation for my further journey in the regulatory world. So the turning point came when I went to a conference in Barcelona in 2012 for presenting my work on spinal cages. And I did FEA and cadaver testing as part of that, and I was presenting this particular work. And in that, while I was presenting, I didn't realize that Dr. Shrin Nagaraja, who was a scientist in Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories at FDA, was part of the audience. So he was listening to my talk, and he was impressed with the work that was being done in this particular study. And he got connected to me post presentation. And while I was chatting, he told me for the first time that FDA is not all about uh, regulations and only review work, but it has a special body of scientists who come as a group to work on specific projects that would change the or that would impact how the reviews are done. So I was quite impressed with that, and I casually exchanged my card saying that, if you have any positions, I'm graduating next year in 2013, please email me. And he contacted me with a postdoc position, which was for 2 years. And then that's how I got into FDA as a postdoctoral fellow. So when I joined there, so I was there for almost 4 years, and I could work on four different research projects. And in these research projects, the important part was the regulatory gap identification. So I'll talk more about it in the coming slides, but I added few key skills such as working with the reviewers, understanding what are the day-to-day challenges, and how a device design is done. So usually when we are working on these kind of regulatory science projects, obtaining devices from the industry was a bit difficult because most of them had their own fears of giving their devices to FDA. So we were trying to develop our own devices and got it manufactured, from the suppliers, which were common to the industry. So I learned about device design, manufacturing, and also worked on few computational modeling projects while I was a postdoc, and had a very good postdoctoral fellowship with 7 journal articles in those 3 to 4 years, and several conference presentations and a couple of awards. So all this led me to learn about how important it is to understand these regulatory concerns and how I can shape up the or how I can address the challenge of the reviewers. That motivated me to pursue further of my career at FDA. So I'm not only helping them with some tools, but also I saw that a few of my colleagues contributed to the documents shown here. So one is the AM technical considerations guidance, and another one was reporting of computational modeling studies guidance. So my colleagues were working on those guidances, and I saw how important those publications were for the industry in streamlining their submissions. So this was kind of an eye opening for me, and that's how I decided that okay, I can make this, I can take up a position at FDA, and that's how uh, when an opening opened up in 2017, I immediately jumped on it, interviewed for it, and received an offer to work as a full-time regulatory scientist. So let me take a step back. I know most of the audience who are coming here, they're from device background, but I want to let you know that FDA, as shown in the background picture here, we have a beautiful campus. It's a big campus, and then it not only regulates devices, but it also regulates several other products such as biologics, tobacco products, and veterinary medicine. And now going deep dive into the devices world. So in this huge organization, so when CDRH regulates medical devices, uh, right from tongue depressors to artificial hearts, so it works in conjunction with several offices as shown here. So for example, OPEC, that's the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, is the main office that reviews devices. And while they are reviewing the devices, so Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories is one of the another office that supports OPEC for doing its review efficiently. So what do I mean by that? So let me explain you in coming slides. So in this huge organization of CDRH, along with OPEC, OSL is one of the important organization. So let me give you a brief perspective of what OSL is. So OSL has more than 150 employees working in 19 different research program areas, and each research program targets a particular device or set of devices. And we publish more than 400 publications per year. And we have a huge lab facility where we develop methods for new technologies and new kind of evaluations that we come up with, and we convert them into other tools that can be used by the industry. So when I say 19 research programs, let me give you a glimpse of what those programs are. So as you can scan through, it goes from additive manufacturing to AI, machine learning, cardiovascular, uh, everything. And so my specific focus program is orthopedics. And going forward, so now let me talk about what regulatory science is. So far I've discovered how regulatory science is shaping up the industry and shaping up our review paradigm. But so this from here I'll talk about what we do in terms of regulatory science. So regulatory science is nothing but developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess safety and effectiveness. So it's not just reviewing submissions, it's creating the frameworks for how to review them. So for example, so we generate standards, guidances, and test methods, and all these tools are used both by industry as well as FDA. you know FDA, our internal stakeholders like reviewers, they use these tools, and they recommend industry to use these particular tools and then evaluate their devices, and it helps them to clearly and clear interpretation of what to expect from this kind of a test method. And coming to the industry, they can use these kind of tools, and they can, once they do their performance testing using these tools, so it becomes easy for them to have less questions from FDA side. So that's how we build a bridge between both FDA and the industry. So in a nutshell, so in 2023, I became a senior regulatory scientist, and then my day-to-day job is focused on three main areas. The first one is technical consulting. That means when a review comes into FDA, a lead reviewer is assigned, and I'm the technical consult on that. So when a computational modeling uh, comes as part of that submission, so they'll contact me to review that, to evaluate the credibility of the evidence, and to evaluate the whole computational modeling report. And then we also participate in standards and guidances to develop several tools and methods, so that these can be induced into the policy. And then we also conduct independent studies to come up with those kind of methodologies that can be used as tools, uh, or in standards. So this is my work in a nutshell. And so, as I've shown you before, in my academic lab, I was more focusing on uh, how I was trying to develop evidence for the industry to use for the FDA submissions. So here I'm reviewing all those generated data. I'm using all my previous experience to review the submissions and review the evidence that was submitted as part of their submissions by the industry. So I'm here, I was working for the government doing the almost same kind of a job, but with a different perspective altogether. So let me give you an example of the regulatory science. So I told you that, we are doing regulatory science, but let me show that in action. So this illustrates how we identify regulatory gaps and how we develop solutions to that. So here I'm showing you a cage, which is made of PEEK. So we developed in-house. And the problem that we are addressing through this is that when the spinal cage is inserted into a patient, so an inserter is attached, which is a surgical instrument, and a mallet is used in the orthopedic surgery. During the surgery, a surgeon uses this mallet and he whacks at this instrument. So we realized that from 2000 to 2017, we analyzed the data and we saw that more than 1,000 medical device reports were reported. So these were the adverse events happening intraoperatively when the surgeon was implanting the cage. And we noticed that these are really more in terms of when compared to the post-op device fractures. And the reviewers and we collaborated to come up with a solution. So we acquired the data from few surgeons, and then we created a bench test method that is able to differentiate between different cage designs and different cage inserter combinations. So overall, we developed a methodology in our lab, and then we published that into Journal of Biomechanics as a peer-reviewed article, and then we took it to standard ASTM standards committee, and then we pitched that for this problem, this methodology would be appropriate, and the whole industry voted for that particular methodology, and now it is published as a standard method in the ASTM. So anywhere a spine industry can use this standard and they can generate the data, and FDA can also review based on the standard, and a reviewer has a tool now to point the industry to this particular methodology. So this is how we bridge the regulatory gaps, and we come up with research methodologies, validate them, publish them, and make it publicly available for the whole industry to use it. So now I spoke about the regulatory science and how we identify gaps. So now let me transition to how computational modeling is being reviewed, and how I use modeling skills in the regulatory space. So there are several ways how we see modeling in different submissions. So I'll give you a glimpse. So the in silico device testing, here is where only the device is tested for safety or effectiveness based on the question. So we get submissions for the devices and we review them. And then we see softwares which has some kind of patient data or anatomy that is being simulated, and the device is evaluated as part of that software. And then in silico clinical trials, where a virtual cohort of patients is created in that particular trial, and then the device is being tested. And there is a particular project that OCEL did where breast implant for the breast imaging devices, virtual imaging trials can be conducted. So, and there is also MDDT. This is a platform of medical device development tools, which can be either coined out by FDA itself, or by the industry or any academician too. So they can come up with this MDDT where a device is multiple devices can be evaluated with the same tool, and it can address a particular question. So how do I use my modeling expertise? So as a modeler, so I'm technically consulted, for submissions where computational modeling studies come in, or where when industry submits their computational model reports. So, and I evaluate those computational models for its credibility, whether it's addressing whether its validation is done appropriately or not, whether it's answering the question for the decision for which it is being submitted. And then the other area where, as a modeler, I work is to develop frameworks for the in silico evidence. So what makes a model acceptable? So that's I think, and we develop frameworks for that. So, and then we conduct few independent analysis, to inform the regulatory decision making. That means our internal stakeholders can have some questions which they see multiple times when they review these computational modeling reports, and they come up with a particular gap. And we try to do some independent studies to answer that particular question, and then we make them available to public in form of journal articles. And then we also participate in standards and guidance developments. For example, ASME VNB 40, a lot of my colleagues were participating, I think, and ASTM standards. I regularly participate and interact, with a lot of those standard committees. So we all take part in that kind of standards and guidance development. So let me give you a, a timeline of how we evolved as modelers at FDA, and how we see this in the past decade. So before 2016, we still used to ask for validation and stuff, but we did not have a particular way for the industry to report it to us. So we came up with a report of computational modeling studies in medical device submissions guidance, so which changed how the computational modeling and simulation studies were reported to FDA, and that eased out our work, because every time when a submission comes in, we have to tell them that this piece was missing. So some piece was under provided, some things were over provided, so we had to tell them this is what we need. So that thing got erased, because now the computational modeling guidance is taking care of that. So, and parallelly, ASME VNV 40, which was led by the industry, so they were doing a great job in trying to come up with how to assess credibility for computational modeling devices through verification and validation. So that started in around 2016 timeline, and that got published in 2018. And after that, even FDA tried to come up with a guidance which specifically focused on how to assess credibility for medical devices, and that too which were using computational modeling and simulations. So again, that took a lot of time, and but finally it was published in 2023. So from in my day-to-day work, I used all these different documents which helps me to point to these particular documents. If industry is not doing a good job in terms of their submissions, I'll point them to here, either in terms of reports, either to assess their credibility. If they are following these correctly, I think half my job is becoming easier, because I need to only review what they've provided, whether they're answering the question correctly. So that's how the last decade has evolved for us. And coming to the future, we already started thinking about how these AI assisted simulations, how can we review them correctly, and how to deal with them. So that's how so this is really important for you to understand that it was a journey. It did not happen overnight. So we've learned through industry, and we have participated with them in standards, and we have created some tools which are not only helpful for us but to the industry as well. And coming to the modeling and submission, so this is one of the example. So there are several standards for each and every device, but uh, there are few specific computational modeling standards, so that helps few device submissions, and those are kind of the run of the mill for us. So industry submits their computational modeling reports based on these standards, and we review them and make sure they're answering the question correctly, either if they are trying to use it for the worst case device analysis, or for patient specific modeling. We try to review them, and we scrutinize them to make sure they are safe for whatever question they are addressing. And coming to another good example that I'd like to provide, and this is a concrete one. So this is a pedicle screw model credibility assessment project that we took up, some of my colleagues. And here they demonstrated end-to-end how to use ASME VNV40. So, and the question here was, can we use computational modeling to assess fracture risk for cannulated versus non-cannulated screws? And they focused on risk assessment, verification, validation, and they have published this in 2024. So we work on projects like these where we not only helping our FDA reviewers, but also telling industry how to use computation and modeling simulation using these frameworks, and so that they can use this example and then do their probably learn from these examples and implement their submissions. So so the key point is that this shows the rigor required. It's not just how the model runs. So can we trust the model for the specific decision? That's what I think all these frameworks point to. And coming to my 2 cents for the young modelers. So I think when you are trying to face regulatory bodies, you should think like that regulatory body, the FDA facing device engineer. So you should have that lens. So first suggestion that I would give is that, define your context of use clearly. Like what exactly are you trying to address? So what question are you asking the model? So is it design choice? Is it safety margin? So you have to define that correctly. So, and based on that specific context of use and what kind of risk that particular model is addressing, based on that, the evidence is required. So what does that mean? You have to match the rigor to risk. So higher risk decisions need stronger credibility packages. And what does that imply means that sophistication, it's not all about sophistication. How cool is your model? So is it relevant? Is the validation that you're generating or the evidence that you're generating, is it relevant for that particular question or for particular decision that model is making? So that is really important. And you can show your VNV, be explicit about your VNV, whether the assumptions that you are having, and as a modeler, what kind of sensitivity and what are the limitations of the model. So it needs to be clear to the regulatory bodies so that the journey is smooth. And then the lastly, what I would stress on is you have to write for traceability. That means a reviewer should be following what is the question clearly, and what are the inputs that you're providing for the model, and what methods are you implementing, what are the boundary conditions, loading conditions, contact conditions. These should be really clear. And what kind of verification validation, and how this verification validation is appropriate. So it should be credibility based. Risk assessment should be done based on the tools that I showed you in earlier slides. And what is the decision impact of the results, that should also be analyzed. So ultimately, you should have an FDA lens, and you should think, can I trust this evidence for this particular decision that this model is trying to get into? If you can answer that clearly, I think you learn trust of the reviewer, and your journey will be smooth during the submission, I think. And this mindset uh, will help you not only to come to FDA as a reviewer, but also if you go to industry, it will help you as a modeler. Yep. So that's it for now. I'll be happy to connect after this presentation. My email is on the slide. So, and also I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to follow regulatory science developments. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Dr. Palepu. I think it was a very interesting perspective hearing how you adopt and use simulation in the regulatory space. So next up, we'll have Dr. Ingmar Fleps, who will be presenting on his journey and his work at Zimmer Biomet.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to share my story here. And thank you, Vivek, for presenting on the FDA perspective already. I think this is a very good primer for the industry perspective afterwards. Yeah, I'm happy to share my perspective on that part. So I'm share screen. Can you all see my screen, my slides? Okay.
Yes.
So my name is Ingmar Fleps. I'm a research senior scientist too at Zimmer Biomet in their computational department. It's a small group, around 8 people that focus purely on computational work or mostly on computational work. And yeah, I'm going to share my career path first, and then later we'll give you a perspective what we do in the group and yeah, how computational modeling goes into that. Starting off, I'm from Germany, engineering-focused region in the Southwest that with all the automotive industry, it was obvious choice for me to actually start my career in mechanical engineering, in automotive engineering. So I'm not kind of based in biomedical science necessarily, but more in engineering. Did my bachelor at Applied University, so already somewhat industry focused in collaboration with an industry company that I also later worked for 2 years. In that company, I developed fiber reinforced composite structures for or modeling approaches for the automotive industry as an external contractor with Mercedes. And that's actually where I first got in contact with research and realized that I really like research and I would like to work in research. So in the mechanical engineering and research department at Mercedes, they were developing these fiber reinforced composite modeling approaches, and the experimental and simulation pyramid that you see on the right here was their validation verification matrix. So that's the first time I got into contact with complex verification validation processes that were also needed for this matching or meeting the standards in the automotive industry. And as a bachelor student in that department, I realized fairly quickly that if I wanted to go further here, I had to study more, I had to learn more. And that meant, amongst other things, doing a master's degree, doing a PhD. A colleague that I talked to that was in medical sciences before and joined the automotive industry before had inspired me that going into medical devices might be another future path. So the path that I had chosen for my master's degree was actually to study material science and focus more on biomedical materials, focusing on bio-nanomaterials, ending up with my master thesis on fiber reinforced materials for bone replacement, in this case, tricalcium phosphates that were reinforced with PLA fibers to replace bone if you, for example, remove bone due to a tumor in a cortical bone. The hope was that we'd get a material that is stronger and tougher, that would actually be load bearing. Project was only partially successful. We managed to make it tougher. We didn't really manage to make the material stronger for bone replacement. Having done my master's degree, I felt like, okay, now I could maybe go into medical technology, but maybe also not. So I applied for both industry positions actually and PhD positions at the time. And one of the positions that I applied for was the professor where I did my PhD later, Professor Ferguson at ETH, and I just called him up basically out of the blue, asked if there will be any projects coming up soon and if you'd need a student. And fortunate enough, with following up with him later, he actually contacted me, and his group had kind of this idea based on my CV. We have this person that has impact modeling experience, previously done car crash simulations. We have image-based modeling expertise in our group, focusing on hip fractures in the elderly. Maybe we can combine this and build models of sideways falls that would actually inform us about how impact processes contribute to fracture risk in the elderly. So that's where I did my PhD at ETH in Zurich and at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver in Canada. And I focused on hip fracture modeling, so very classical hard tissue mechanics, going to the European Society of Biomechanics very often for conferences. And I applied the multi-level validation that I'd learned in the automotive industry to these new processes, going from tissue level, organ level validation, like shown here on the left, to a more system level validation shown on the right, where we build a very complex experimental impactor in the end that simulates a sideways fall in an inertia-driven experiment, and building complementary finite element models that model each bone that we tested complementary in the simulation to validate, but then also to use those models to better understand what is actually happening on the inside, which particular parts of the model of the system matter most, how would it behave if we changed certain properties and so on. So that put me in kind of firmly into the orthopedics world now with image-based modeling and application in hip fracture. I also had realized that I really like doing academic research at the time. And since research was going well, I stayed as a postdoc. So first I applied for a fellowship, stayed for 2 years longer at ETH, and actually drove the validation even further, going past the system level validation to a clinical validation, working with the Icelandic cohort at the Icelandic Heart Association, where we then modeled a somewhat simpler system, but applied it to 600 patients and demonstrated that hip fracture risk is well predicted with finite element models, and that it's comparable, if not slightly superior to typical metrics like error bone mineral density or volumetric bone mineral density. So that's, that gave me kind of a more perspective of automation and how to apply this to a population, not just going into like ever more complex systems, but also how do we apply this to like the broad spectrum of diversity that we see in the population. Next to that, I try to keep up the connection to medical devices with implementing hip protectors, for example, 2D impact models, or preventive strategies like surgical augmentation prior to experiencing a hip fracture in order to strengthen the femur. Or on the right here, showing a cranial implant that we evaluate for its strength and impact resistance. Before coming to industry, the final step that I had done was doing another postdoc, and I felt like hard tissue engineering is interesting, but soft tissues were a topic of the future as well. So I wanted to work at the transition between the two, and I'd started a postdoc at Boston University in Lise Morgan's lab, focusing on the intervertebral disc, on the poroelastic properties, looking at the interaction between solid stresses, fluid pressure, in the intervertebral disc, and then also in the adjacent vertebra. During that time, I was kind of, you could say, lucky, having a colleague in Switzerland that had recently started at Zimmer Biomet. And he had heard about a project that they were going to do that fit my career path really well. So he had reached out to me and gave me the contact of my now group head, and just told me to reach out on LinkedIn, submit my application if I'm interested. And since I started out kind of in industry research already, I'd never excluded going back into industry research and working on orthopedic devices. So I sent my application, I talked to my group head, and was fortunate enough to get the job. And that's maybe not the most conventional one, because I at the time not even considered applying to other industry positions. It was just this opportunity came up, and being open to it, I was lucky to get it. The project that I was hired for was, it felt a bit tailor-made for my track record, but it was also very research focused, which made my transition into industry actually very smooth and very easy, at times feeling almost like I'm doing another postdoc. I was hired on a project that actually did cadaveric testing again, in this case, all the shoulder, looking at the micromotion between an implant and the bone. And we were interested in how does bone density affect the micromotion that this implant experiences, and are there other factors that are patient-specific, for example, that contribute to that micromotion. So my first year or two at Zimmer Biomet actually consisted of planning a pretty typical scientific study, mapping out sensitivities like shown on the right here. If we assume that the surgery is only accurate to a certain degree, and we assess bone density, for example, how useful is that? Does an inaccurate surgery kind of compromise our estimate of the stability of that bone? So that gave me an easy transition into industry. And now I'd like to give you just a kind of rough overview over what we do in the group, because it's not all research focused, and then also a bit examples of what research we do. So as I said, we're about 8 people. A lot of our work is actually either research activities that try to understand the devices better. So that's more for us internally, understanding mechanisms of interactions between bone and devices, and then trying to use those mechanisms obviously later then to improve devices and build better devices. Another aspect is working quite closely with development, and I feel like that's an ever-evolving and improving kind of process where we get into the development processes earlier on. We can do parameter studies, inform the device design in the end to make it more data-driven and inform how they could improve their devices in an early stage with computational models. Often, or pretty much all the time, these mechanisms and these improvements are then later tested experimentally. So computational modeling at Zimmer Biomet is so far, I would say, in very, very rare circumstances, really the last instance. Very often it informs what design changes are reasonable, what was a promising new design, and also what test conditions are the most relevant to apply experimentally. As you can imagine, with a lot of implants, there are many loading scenarios that are potentially useful for, let's say, a shoulder implant. You do so many activities with your shoulder that any kind of loading vector could seem reasonable. But what we're often interested in is what are the loading vectors that happen most frequently and also that apply the most stringent loads on the implants in order to compromise its stability in the bone. And finite element models can help us identify which are the worst conditions that then are tested experimentally to confirm that our implant actually does well in those testing conditions. Apart from that, our group is also involved in scientific publications. So that's kind of disseminating the findings for our implants and why we think our implants are actually good at in clinical practice. And also in standard development. So we had, for example, our department head, Jeff Bishop, was very involved in VNV40. And also in other standards, we have typically people assigned that look into standards, that get involved in discussions, that try to drive what we as industry see meaningful for specific testing in different instances. So there's a lot of work around that as well. So this is the rough overview of what our group does. It's not all kind of classical academic research. I would say I was lucky with starting with something that is very academically focused. And also the entrance to the group can be very diverse. I came directly from academia with this connection that I had through my friend. We have other people in the group that, for example, started in clinical affairs at Zimmer Biomet, got experience there on managing clinical studies, but had a strong background in biomechanics and computational modeling, and then joined our group a year or two later. And often these people bring very valuable perspectives to us because now they understand how clinical studies are performed, what data requirements they have, how we can potentially share data between clinical studies and computational biomechanics. So having these different perspectives from quality and regulatory and from clinical affairs is very useful to us and is a valid and good way to get into the computational research group. To share some more examples of what we do, we quite frequently still go to conferences. The left here is a conference that we contributed to at the European Society of Biomechanics, but I've also gone to other more applied conferences now, like the ISTA, which is the International Society for Technology and Arthroplasty, or the AOS, the American Academy for Orthopedic Surgeons. So it's often more surgery focused. And the work that we present is often on, as I said, understanding mechanisms for our implants. On the left here, we see, for example, one of our shoulder implants in a cadaveric model. And on the right, we have the computational models where we try to understand how modeling parameters, in this case on the screen, the gap size that we model between the implant and the bone, affect the results that we predict. And that helps us in two ways. It helps us to do better with modeling if we later need to model this, but it also helps us better understand what is important when we design the implant. How do we want to control the gap? What assumptions should we make when we design the implant? Is an assumption of no gap or a gap, is that realistic? And should we really do that? Other examples that our group develops and that we're working towards are in silico clinical trials, and there Vivek had already primed nicely with his slides, and I think one of the images was even from our group, where we've developed internal workflows for building automated finite models that include material mapping of bones and also implants, and try to use them to understand how different implant systems compare and how to make implant system better. So on the left is an image of our framework that we created and published. And at the time, I was not even yet at Zimmer Biomet. So that's my group head that published here. And on the right, we have a publication that is a more recent one from a colleague that worked on stress shielding, basically, and showed how two different implant systems compare with respect to stress shielding over a larger population of Homo. So this is kind of the rough overview of what our group does. I have the impression that we're going more towards trusting computational models. Obviously, they need to be validated well, and our group is partially, I would say, responsible for making sure that standards are being followed, that good workflow and good practices are being followed, and that we stay on top of new developments, such as the ones that Vivek had mentioned, with new standards coming out, standard processes changing, and everything being documented in a way that if we submit it, for example, to the FDA and use computational models as support, that everything is in place. So it's easy to review, it's easy to understand, it's very clear why for that specific context of use, we're confident that our model provides the input that we need. Yeah, and yeah, that's mostly what our group does. I'm happy to answer any questions. Happy if you reach out. My email is here. I'm also on LinkedIn. Yeah, happy to chat. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Fleps. We appreciate hearing your industry perspective from one of the big orthopedic giants in, globally. And I think this is a perfect segue into Dr. Lakshmi Dasi's talk, where he will be discussing his path and his implementation of computational modeling and simulation actually in the clinical workflow itself. So Dr. Dasi, please take it away.
So, I'll talk a little bit about, I'm an academic. I got my PhD, and then eventually I moved on to start a company, and I still work as a professor. So I'm in that academic to startup transition mode. So I'll talk a little bit about my journey. And Dasi Simulations is the company that I founded based on research from my lab. So I hope to share some of the insights into this transition zone where I've been living. So a background about my career path. So in 1998, I graduated with a degree, Bachelor of Technology from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. My degree was in civil engineering. So I was really excited about mechanics overall. Structural mechanics was my favorite course. And then I came to Georgia Tech to do a PhD, and my PhD was also in civil and environmental engineering. And by this time, my work was in the fluid mechanics side of things. So I started learning, both computational and experimental techniques for modeling fluid flow in a more civil engineering context. But after I graduated with my PhD, I went on, did a postdoc at Georgia Tech in biomedical engineering. One of the professors there was hiring somebody who's, deep in fluid flow, but wanted someone to apply that in a cardiovascular problem. And in this problem was artificial heart valves. So that started my postdoctoral journey that went on till 2009 when I joined Colorado State University as an assistant professor in mechanical engineering. So at this point, I was starting my own research lab, thinking about next generation technologies in the cardiovascular area. And then I came to Ohio in 2015 as an associate professor. Ohio State really changed the game for me. My lab was now located in the medical school at Ohio Center. Even though I'm an engineering faculty, all my students were engineers. we were in a medical school setting. And the coolest thing there was I was able to sit down every Monday on a clinical conference where physicians were listening, were actually making decisions about how to treat heart valve disease patients. So I'll get to that. Kind of the idea began there. But 2020 is when I became a professor at Georgia Tech. 2020 is also the time when I became a founder and chief technology officer of Dasi Simulations. So that's a little bit about my career progression. So before I go into the story of the idea, I'll give a little background. I don't know the exact background of all the folks who are listening, so I'll give a very quick overview. So the aortic valve, as you know, is one of the 4 valves in our body. It controls blood flow between the left ventricle and the aorta. This is a standard sketch. And if you actually look at the aortic valve, it has 3 leaflets that open and close. So these are the 3 leaflets that are opening and closing. This is an in vitro experiment just to give you an idea of what's happening to the aortic valve. But in the sketch, you'll also see that there's these structures called sinuses. The 3 leaflets, the right and the non is shown here. But there's this thing called the annulus. So what happens is a lot of us are born with healthy. Eventually, as we grow and age, some of us get the diseases. So what you see here are pictures of diseased aortic valve. Unfortunately, what's happening in these patients is these rocks of calcium, for whatever reason, due to inflammatory processes, eventually they harden and they become calcified. And it becomes difficult for the ventricle to push blood because it has to overcome the stresses of the stiff aortic valve leaflets. So a breakthrough technology called transcatheter aortic valve replacement, which is shown here, is how patients are treated. Essentially what it is it's a metal stent that you can see on the right-hand side. It's implanted via catheter. The stent is on a balloon. Okay, so you see the balloon here. And once the balloon is taken out of the way, there are these leaflets that are sewn onto the metal frame that take over the function of the aortic valve. So that's a quick background into aortic valve disease. This is sort of my research area that my lab at Ohio State was working on. So like I mentioned, at Ohio State, I was very fortunate, myself and my students, we were fortunate to sit down with physicians every Monday morning. It starts at like 6:30 a.m. And they're looking at images like the images that you see on the screen right here. They're looking at images like the one that you're seeing here, and they're trying to make a decision about how do I treat this patient. So this is a case, 81-year-old male. Okay, so there are some measurements. Sinus of Valsalva, is pretty large, 36 millimeters. Generally, they worry if it's less than 30 millimeters. Coronary height means, like, if you see the picture on the right-hand side, there is a branch that comes out of the aorta, which is the coronary artery. So coronary arteries are the arteries that feed blood to the heart itself. So they're the first branches coming off. They're very close to the aortic valve itself. The bright spots that you see here are the calcium nodules. That's the disease I showed you in the picture in the previous slides. So the doctors, thought everything looks good. The measurements look fine. 11.8 is greater than 10. So this should be a routine TAVR case. Unfortunately, when they went in, they did the catheter procedure that I was talking about earlier. So this was the stent. You're looking at a video of a fluorogram. The coronary artery, which is shown here, is completely shut off. It's blocked off by this calcium piece. And the physicians are in panic mode. Apparently, what happens is if you block up the coronary artery, you literally have only seconds to save this patient. Unfortunately, this patient died. And during the next couple of weeks, I was attending the morbidity, mortality meetings, trying to understand, how did this how did this happen? Supposedly a routine case ends up with a patient, dead, and you got to explain the family. It's all a big problem, right? So me and my engineering students, we went back. We created a computational model, and this was done using finite element method, the same methods that you've heard from both Vivek and Ingmar. Finite element method helps you simulate, how materials act under loading conditions. So we made some assumptions and simplifications, and look what we were able to show. In this image, we were able to show that the computer model from that CT scan that you see on the top was able to show that that coronary is going to completely get blocked. You can actually see the branch here and the calcium. And this is another view with a very small opening. So this sort of gave us the idea. This was 2015. So December of 2015, I was thinking, you know what? Looks like computational modeling could have saved this patient. If only the doctors saw this ahead of time, they would have known what was coming in the operating room. So this was the first time I thought that, someday I need to take this into a product that every hospital, every patient needs to have this sort of a modeling done. So that's kind of how Dasi Simulations story began. I filed a few patents at Ohio State, and by 2020, I found a co-founder, which is extremely important to find the right partner to really help develop the business, because you're not only developing a product, you're developing a business, which means all of the aspects of the business needs to be top notch. Just with my academic background, I couldn't see how I can actually build a company. I can build a product, maybe I can do research, but building products, getting them FDA cleared, building a business, having a commercial team, it goes beyond what academics can do by themselves. So Dasi Simulations was formed with my co-founder 2020. Our mission was to use AI, deep science, digital twin technology to help with the patients like I talked about. So save lives by helping physicians make the right decision. Everything boils down to making the right decision. The field is really big. Heart disease is the number one killer still. And if you think about structural heart disease are diseases where normally you go in with an implant, and the way the implant interacts with the heart decides whether it's going to be a success or a failure. And it's a extremely big market. And this is sort of what my vision was, is to develop decision-making tools in the field of structural heart. And our vision goes beyond structural heart. So if you think about what is the problem, so if you're ever thinking about a product or a company, you have to think about the pain point that you're solving. And this thing is called, value proposition. So the word value proposition really means that whatever you develop needs to have value, and somebody needs to appreciate that value, and they're actually going to be able to pay money to buy that product. So what is the problem that we were solving? So the way we explain the problem is decisions are made every day by doctors to treat patients. How are they making the decision? Currently, when it comes to structural heart problems, decisions are made without any warning or forecasting tools. They just look at the images and they use their clinical intuition that's in their mind. They do have a team, they do discuss with other physicians, but then in the end, they make a decision based on their instincts. And usually that's really good if you're at a very good center. But if you think about transcatheter aortic valve replacement, you have 100,000 patients treated every year across 1,000 hospitals. So it's a scaling problem. So you have a product that worked really well in clinical trials, but when you scale it to 100,000 people in 1,000 different centers, things are going to slip through the cracks. There will be wrong decisions that are made, and patients are going to get impacted. So what we saw is that the way the clinical workflow of decision making has some problems within it. So the first problem is extremely manual process of how images are analyzed. So the picture on the top left-hand side shows you, every CT scan, somebody has to go draw lines and circles and make measurements. So there's a human error aspect to it. Industry actually helps the physicians here, and there's some sales rep bias that also gets injected into the workflow. The second problem is the decision itself. When a decision is made, there's many options on the table. The video that I showed you of the transcatheter valve, that was a balloon expandable valve. You have other technologies like self-expanding valve. You have open heart surgery. You also have patients who can be treated just with medication. So 4 options on the table. How does a doctor know how to make the right decision, right? So this is where I was talking about the scaling problem. It all boils down to the physician and how well the physician can anticipate problems for that specific anatomy. And the other problem is these patients are lifetime patients. So they not only have a procedure that you're trying to plan for, they will come back for a second or a third procedure in the next 10 years. So a lot of the times the decisions you make today are going to impact the future lifetime planning for these patients. So the consequences, which is the pain point on the right-hand side, basically some patients unfortunately pay for the problem with their lives. Hospitals, even if the patient's fine, sometimes what happens is the outcome is not the best and patient has to come back within 30 days. Hospitals eat a lot of expenses here. Over $2 billion a year just go into complication costs, and none of that is reimbursed. Hospitals write it off as a loss. And the last thing I mentioned is the lifetime planning. So Dasi Simulations has come a long way since a finite element that I showed you back in 2015. So right now what we are doing is we developed an app that can be on a phone. And what the app does is it ingests the CT scan, and then it actually creates a real-time interactive model for the physician. And the physician can interact with the digital twin, do the procedure in the patient, and then kind of the app will give them predictions of whether there will be coronary obstruction or whether there will be some other kind of complications. Just to give a little highlight of how this works, we essentially took the physics nature. So we took the physics nature of finite element model, and we developed this another method, which is called a particle. It's a particle-based method. It's proprietary, but the way this works is unlike solving governing equations like what finite element does. This one trains using the data. So it's a mixture of data science and physics-based model, and you can train this to if you give it a lot of ground truth data like pre-procedural and post-procedural information, it can learn to make a right prediction, and that too, it'll make it much faster than traditional physics-based models. And how well does this AI work? So we were able to submit to the FDA. We were able to demonstrate to the FDA that you can actually believe the outputs of this model. And the FDA was very particular about all of the assumptions and what is the clinical acceptance criteria and what is the how do you define success? Why is it clinically meaningful? So all of those were part of the discussions, but we were able to show that the model is accurately able to predict how these valves deform, how does the anatomy deform, and what can the physicians take out of this. So we developed this concept called biomarkers. So once you have the model, you can actually, in this case, this is one of the real coronary obstruction cases. You can see the right coronary of this patient is going to get obstructed here. The contour map shown here in this rotating video shows you stretch, which is the deformation of the tissue, and you can predict annular rupture with this biomarker. Here we have a reduced order computational fluids model, so the red lines are streamlines, and this is physicians use this to predict potential for leakage, blood leakage in this device. And then, like I mentioned, future planning, we can also put a second valve inside the first valve and predict the future planning for this patient. So overall, we were able to launch this, and we also got Medicare to reimburse this technology, and we were already making a difference. And this is what we call the Dasi difference, where this patient is another patient who unfortunately, passed away from complication called root rupture. You can see the blood leaking out here in a plume in the chest, and our model was able to show this hot spot from this calcium. So it's very patient specific, and we were able to tell the physician that this patient would have. This was a retrospective case. The patient already passed away, and the physician sent this case as a blinded test to see if the model would have predicted this, and this is what we were able to generate. So the way this works is hospitals, we were able to, one of the things that made this possible is we looked at HeartFlow. HeartFlow is another company that was a Stanford academic launched company. Today it's an IPO, $2 billion worth company. But they kind of paved the way for this whole, human in the loop, AI, digital twin, paradigm. So hospitals the physician orders for our product. We are integrated into the hospital imaging platforms. The CT scans come into our AWS servers, and then the models are run. There's a human check, and then the result is, pushed into the app where the physician can interactively, work on the digital twin. There's also a downloadable form. So overall, we were able to work with the FDA. 2020 is when we formed the company. The FDA clearance came 2023, and we actually had to go twice. Our first time, we had a rejection just because there was just so much. Even AI in the cardiovascular space is new. There was just so much burden that it wasn't possible to do it within the time frame for a 510K. So we had to reset and then submit our 510K. But eventually we now have 2 cleared products. We've already done more than 3,000 patients prospectively. We are also building our clinical publications. Very important. If you have a product and if you don't have reimbursement, doesn't matter if you have FDA clearance or not, that company is going to die. That's the sad reality of medtech in the US. Reimbursement is such a crucial piece. You need to develop the data that will show to the Medicare that there's actually a benefit. Otherwise, you're stuck with showing another way hospitals can benefit using your product, which is generally a much tougher sell. Have a lot of patents. You do need a lot of IP protection. Otherwise, investors are not going to invest in something that is completely exposed, especially now with so much happening in the AI space. You really need to have a solid case that you do have a unique and IP protectable technology. Develop partnerships. So one of the key things we found was that there's no way you're going to be successful. The key catalyst is early partnerships. We were blessed with, back in 2020, I was working with a hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, Piedmont Hospital, and they were open to kind of develop a research agreement. We had an IRB protocol, and we were able to do very early prospective trials there. And literally, it helps shape the product. Because if you have a product that doesn't fit in the clinical workflow, no matter how cool it is, clinicians are not going to use it. So you need to develop a product that actually makes sense, and it should be in the same time scale as a physician decision making happens, because physicians are not going to want to change the entire clinical workflow for a product. We also were able to develop partnerships with Cleveland Clinic because we want to take this to intraoperative decision making. So we went to Cleveland Clinic, and then Medtronic is the most recent partnership that we were able to develop. Solid, medical team is something that you need to assemble. We were blessed with assembling a solid team. So overall, we have 144 hospitals overall that's been, working with us. This number is a little dated. We have more than 60 executed agreements. The company is now revenue generating, which is always good to see that the idea that you initially came up with is actually, making an impact. So now we've just reaching the break-even point with, almost like $500,000 a month in revenues. And we look forward to doing more. So we have not only the aortic valve, but a lot of other verticals that we can go after that can really make this a bigger success than just a one product company. So the partnerships, you need a strategy to grow into Europe and the rest of the world, as well as a strategy to go into the intraoperative robotic, like where a lot of surgery is going into robotics. So eventually, you also need to develop your product, digital twins that can take your product to where the field is also going. So a lot of things have to come in place. I think it's best to do a more interactive session now. I just want to quickly thank, not only my lab members that are on the left-hand side, a lot of graduate students, postdocs, PhD students, but as we grew the company on the right-hand side, we were blessed with a great team. And, maybe some other time we can talk about building a company is very different than building a product. You need to develop a culture. You need to develop people who are passionate about it, as well as a commercialization operation that is geared for success. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Yogesh. Looking forward to some interactive discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Dasi. That was definitely an awesome presentation. Very interesting to hear how you actually spun this out of the lab and into an actual clinical workflow and even getting reimbursement for it. So very, very awesome. All right, so we can shift into the question and answer portion. Actually, I'll go ahead and just not share my screen. I think we can just have an open roundtable discussion. And it looks like we have two individuals who are raising their hands right now.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation and wonderful work. It's really informative. So my just one confusion, basically, I would like to know whatever you have presented in terms of the FDA, in terms of the simulation and modeling, it's more or less the finite element and structural part. So what are the regulatory options and other modeling options you must say in terms of the CFD and free structure interaction?
Yeah, so I think, and please feel free to correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but when we were talking about the regulatory submissions in Vivek's and Ingmar's discussion, it was mostly on finite element analysis and structural analysis. And Dr. Dasi, a lot of your work is in computational fluid dynamics. I think the question was kind of broadly, are there other kind of guidelines when you are using different simulation techniques when submitting for regulatory clearance? I think that was the interpretation that I understood.
Yeah, that is quite similar. And how we should do the particularly the safety and fluid structure interaction part. What point we should keep in mind if we submit a safety result, particularly blood flow or the multiphysics simulation for the regulatory approval?
So when we started doing this, we didn't really find a lot of guidelines. When you have an established product, like whether it's like a knee implant or hip implant or artificial heart valve, there's like ISO documents and there's guidance documents. and you know literally all of the testing and validation that you need to show efficacy and safety of the product. But when you have a model like a CFD model or a structural model, it really boils down to how is the product going to be used in the clinic. What the FDA goes and first decides whether it's a class 2 or a class 3 product based on the risks that the model has. Ours was a class 2, and there was a predicate device that was already that we could identify. So we were able to base at least most of the as a straight 510K. Now, the precise verification validation data that really came from a pre-submission. So even before we submitted our 510K, we had a meeting with the FDA to kind of introduce our ideas and the product. And the FDA took its time to understand what we are trying to do, what the model is, what are the inputs of the model and the outputs of the model, and how will the model be used by a doctor. And then they came up with their own. They actually went and consulted with experts within the FDA, like Vivek would be one of the experts. And we had meetings with those experts. And then finally, we all came to a same page on, here's what we need to actually show that this is validated. And it all boiled down to real human data that we needed to collect to convince the FDA that it's not only safe and efficacious, but also there's a whole host of other things, like the entire quality management, the quality side of the product development, the cybersecurity part of the product. There's like a whole host of things beyond just the model itself.
I actually had a quick question kind of going off of what Dr. Dasi was saying. So, we're seeing this big push, especially in the cardiothoracic industry. We're seeing how simulation can be used in the clinical workflow. And I think, at least from my perspective, being in the orthopedic space, that we're quite behind the cardiothoracic space. And Ingmar, you and I have had this conversation before. When you're using simulation for a clinical workflow, obviously everything is prospective. So it's, all the new geometries are going to be different. Their fluid dynamics are going to be completely different. The medical history is completely different. Can you kind of broadly speak about how you guys established VVUQ? And for the audience members, VVUQ is verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification, especially if you're using simulation in this. And I would love to hear Ingmar and Vivek's 2 cents on this as well.
Yeah, I can go first. I think that's a great question. To start with, as we have seen, the main thing with VVQ is being in the academia, you tend to create a model that can do everything. That's not how it works for FDA. As the other panelists mentioned earlier, if you're coming to FDA, you need to come with a specific question. What's your device, or where your model is being used? What is the context of use? So if that is clear, you should try to spin around, what kind of uncertainties that model can bring in and how to address them. If your model is using in particular sequence or particular context, where your model is being used, you should address, if the model doesn't work for that particular purpose, what other uncertainties can happen and how you are trying to cover that up. So that's kind of, that's why VVQ is really important, when you come to a regulatory body. Yeah.
Yes, from the industry perspective there, I would say we're not quite there yet from what you'd mentioned, where we're in the clinics, kind of having a live simulation or bringing the simulation directly to the surgery to make that decision. So I think from kind of the perspective of Zimmer Biomet, it's more that we're in the development processes, and there it's exactly what Vivek had just mentioned. You need to define specifically what is the risk associated with the decision that I want to make, what specific decision do I want to make, what evidence do I have that my model is credible for that decision and that I've mapped out sensitivities for inputs and outputs. And then you make that one specific decision. And as soon as you move to maybe even a different aspect of the same implant, you might build a new model with a new context of use that is specifically validated for that new context of use. So instead of like often academic publication, you have this one model and you look at everything in that one model. It's very often very specialized. And that's where the definition of what you use your model for is extremely important and informs basically your whole verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification.
Appreciate that. Thank you. All right. It looks like next question from the audience is Sheikh Umarazani. If you can kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, is everyone able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question's a little bit more general. So as, for example, like a PhD student, you're interested in doing in silico modeling. How do you feel like, for example, when you transition into industry, how does the gap in your knowledge change? So for example, if there's like a certain skill maybe you've not been encountered with before in your academic role, how are you supported in industry? And do you feel like if you go from a PhD to industry straight away, or you do a PhD, then a postdoc, and then go into industry, would that make you better prepared? Or do you feel like the avenue that you choose doesn't matter if the end goal would be similar?
I can maybe try to give
Yeah,
my
I think, yeah,
perspective
this is
first as the
directly
one.
pointing to you guys, not
Yes.
me.
So from my perspective, I mean, I came with 2 postdocs and had this luck basically of starting with a very research-based project. I had the impression that one of the things that I noticed very quickly is that industry had a much stronger plan of how to integrate you into the team. In the different research departments that I had been in before, you often you're left kind of with your own kind of topic, your own thoughts, your own investigations, and there's not a lot of knowledge transfer. Where in industry, you were directly confronted with, here are the work processes that we have these validation documents, these are the procedures that you need to learn in order to be able to run computational models that are very specific for our company processes. And there was a lot more interaction with my colleagues, a lot more direct asking instead of you having to figure out everything by yourself. If it was quicker to ask your colleague and get a 5-minute response that saves you a week of work, that's completely a valid approach. Where from academia, I was very often used to figuring it out by myself. Like the approach was you're there to learn and it's your job to figure it out. So I think that was one of the big differences for me. That in industry, that's not really the goal anymore. You're there to provide useful information, useful inputs, and acquiring knowledge came very often through these processes and through colleagues, and it felt more collaborative in that sense. So that was definitely one of the strong differences that I had seen. Coming after your PhD directly, even after your master's or a postdoc, is all possible. You just come in with different experiences. You might come at us at a different level, and you can definitely also collect research experience in an industry setting, doing different studies, doing different comparisons, and learning more about computational modeling. I actually have the impression in my current job, I'm exposed to very different methodologies. I sometimes do morphological analysis, sometimes density analyses, sometimes finite element modeling. So it's not that you come in and then you're fixed to this one topic. You can still expand your horizon, go to conferences, and yeah, get all the experience that you might get otherwise during a postdoc. You just have a different lens that you see the projects through because it's often very product related in industry.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, so I think if you're working for a big company, I think that makes a big cultural difference. If you're working in a startup, I think you still might have to, swim on your own to cross the ocean. So like Dr. Lakshmi Dasi had said, like, he had to figure out, with FDA and collaborate with several other professionals to figure out, how to come up with, a solution for a particular problem. So it differs, where you are landing in.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. So if you're landing in a early stage startup company, whether you land in an early stage startup company or a very established multinational industry, when somebody hires you, they have a project in mind and they have already looked at your background and are impressed with you and are confident that you will actually be able to deliver in whatever they have chosen for you to do. So once you do join the industry position, you definitely will be in a setting where you are provided with resources to be successful, but at the same time, the level of expectations of like what you need to figure out might be different based on whether you're in an early startup company versus much later. So yeah, the processes may not be all well defined. You might be the person who will be developing the processes, but rest assured, if you're selected, somebody is already is confident that you're going to be successful.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So I have the next question is recent times while we are mostly working with the CT or MRI data from the real patient, we are also using some virtual patient cohort. So in terms of the regulatory approval, how we are differentiating in silico trial with like virtual patient cohort and the in silico trial with the real patient data?
Yeah, I think in silico trial, I think it's evolving. Whereas real cohort patient data, I think when you have a real patient data, that makes a difference because that's considered as a real world evidence, and that's more straightforward. Whereas for in silico trial, I think you need more VVUQ, to understand whether it is working as intended or not. So that's a pretty straightforward difference that I can point out to in terms of how a device is analyzed. Yeah, I think I'll pass it on to other panels as well, other panelists. Yeah.
I think, for our efforts, I think the in silico clinical trial aspects are very much in development at the moment. So we don't have kind of regulatory approval for those so far. For us, it's more that we're experimenting with how we can use this to develop better implants and maybe at some point use it for regulatory approval. But that's still in the process, and we're using more kind of CT scans that were collected in a cohort without any kind of live clinical data or synthetic cohorts or such. So we're really focused on the retrospective cohorts there.
Same for us. Most of the trials for a product that is a decision support product using AI, the trials are retrospective trials to on a cohort where there's already ground truth available, and you can see if the predictions that the software is making is actually valid or not. We do hear about in silico trials, but I feel like it will be a while before FDA might actually use that as a common thing. Most like at least for heart valves are a class 3 device, and when a company like Medtronic comes up with a new heart valve, it has to go into a human before FDA finally gets convinced that there is merit to giving it a FDA approval. In silico trials will be a component of the full package, but there will always be the real trial.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Dr. Dasi, because I think right now, where the in silico trials are, it's more like of a complement rather than replacing the whole clinical trial.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It looks like we have one more question. Since we are at time, if you could kindly ask it quickly, that would be greatly appreciated.
I have a very quick question. It's just about, for example, in each of your roles that you are now in, how much simulation work do you feel that you actually do? And is this something that you feel like, for example, you miss kind of doing more simulation work, or are you happy with a combination of simulation plus maybe admin, maybe business, clinical? How would you kind of navigate that to say to a student where, for example, maybe this role will be suited for you based on XYZ interests?
I mean, I can give a quick answer. Even though I'm the founder, chief technology officer, most of my time goes in management and administrative roles, but I am also very actively part of the product, continuous product development. So as part of that, I still write code and run simulations myself. But I can see that that's going to become less and less because as we grow our product team, there are more dedicated folks who can do this than what I was able to do in the early part of the company, when the founders really have to get their hands dirty with the product development themselves.
Yeah, for my case, we review a lot. Like half the time goes into review work, and half the time, we do, the projects. So based on the project, we need to do extensive modeling, or for a few projects, we don't need to do modeling. We need to focus more on bench testing. But ultimately, I think there are two to three ways where we keep ourselves involved. For example, there's a new technology like particle-based modeling. A couple of years back, like we were trying to understand, how that works. So we were trying to continuously engage, with the industry and several other folks who are working on that. So when a new technology comes in, we are always interested to get our hands dirty and hands on how that works, because that keeps us updated. To review new technology, we need to understand that first. So we'd love to get our hands-on experience on those kind of softwares. We get demos, we go to industry conferences, and we work on different workshops where we learn about these modern technologies, and that's how we either buy them to use for our individual purposes or research purposes, and then get on the head of it to regulate it. Yeah.
My perspective, I'd say my role is still quite technical. So comparing it to like a postdoc or PhD position, I do run quite a lot of simulations or do morphological analyses. Obviously, we also write reports, but you can compare that similar to like paper writing, which we also do, and often the reports and papers have quite a lot of commonalities. So I would say from coming out of academia, I didn't feel like out of a sudden I don't run simulations anymore. One of the key differences for me was that in academia, often I developed the model over like 2-3 years. So that was a very long process. It was a very tough process. And in industry, there's often a lot of more short-lived projects where you need to answer a very specific question with a model that maybe we have something similar already. So the methodology is not as difficult to establish anymore. And then it might be a 2-3 month project and you move on to the next one. So there are kind of both type of projects where sometimes you have this longer project in industry as well, but very often you have these shorter projects where the model development doesn't take quite as long because it's clearer what you need to do. With having the verification validation standards, it's much clearer what you need to take care of in your model in order to be able to rely on it. So that's, I would say, the key difference for me, running less models, but more doing more diverse modeling and shorter projects.
Awesome. Thank you for the question. I think that wraps up our session. I'll go ahead and just share my screen real quick. So just a quick plug for the VPH 2026 conference that's going to be taking place between September 1st through the 4th in beautiful Milan, Italy. So the registration for that is open. This is our flagship conference that we host. So please feel free to register for that and connect with other individuals in the modeling space. And again, another webinar that we have planned next month is on May 28th. It will be moderated by Luca Bontempi and Elena Radielli. It'll be on integrating in silico and experimental approaches in biomedical research, challenges and best practices. I'd like to thank all of the speakers. I think this was a really great session. We had a lot of people in attendance, so I think a lot of individuals really enjoyed it, hearing the perspectives from academia, from industry, and that transition from academia into industry, into startups and regulatory. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great day.